Margaret Beaufort was 6 years old when her guardians first sold her. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally sold her like a prized heifer at market. While other children her age played with wooden toys and learned their letters, Margaret was learning that her tiny body was worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Her inheritance made her the most valuable commodity in 15th century England, and everyone wanted a piece. The Beaufort fortune was staggering, land stretching across multiple counties, political connections that could topple kingdoms, and enough gold to fund armies. Margaret's father had died when she was barely a year old, leaving this incredible wealth in the hands of a baby girl who couldn't even pronounce her own surname properly. To medieval power brokers, she wasn't a child. She was a walking, breathing lottery ticket that needed to be claimed before someone else got there first. John de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, struck first. He paid Margaret's guardians a fortune to marry her to his son, another John, when she was just 6 years old. The wedding ceremony was performed with Margaret standing on a wooden box so she could reach the altar. Court records show that the little bride wore a dress made from cloth of gold that cost more than most nobles' annual income, but she was so small that the fabric had to be gathered and pinned just so she wouldn't trip over it. But here's where medieval marriage politics gets truly twisted. Within 3 years, political winds shifted. The Duke of Suffolk fell from favor, and suddenly Margaret's marriage to his son became a liability rather than an asset. So they simply declared the marriage invalid. Margaret was 9 years old, and she had just experienced her first divorce without even understanding what marriage meant. Her guardians immediately put her back on the market. This time, the buyer was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who wanted to marry her to his own son. Another ceremony, another child bride standing on another wooden box, another fortune-changing hands. But this arrangement lasted even less time than the first. Somerset was executed for treason within 2 years, leaving Margaret orphaned again and her second marriage conveniently forgotten. By age 11, Margaret had been married twice, divorced twice, and was about to be sold for the 3rd time. The winning bidder was Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, a 24-year-old man who had been watching this grotesque auction with growing impatience. Unlike her previous husbands, Edmund had no intention of waiting for Margaret to mature before claiming his prize. Medieval marriage law technically required waiting until a girl reached puberty before consummation, but the law was flexible when enough money was involved. Edmund had paid an enormous sum for Margaret, not just for her inheritance but for her proven fertility bloodline. The Beauforts were known for producing healthy children, and at 24, Edmund was tired of waiting for his investment to pay off. He had been patient enough watching other men profit from Margaret's wealth while he waited his turn. The wedding ceremony in 1455 was lavish, as befitted such an important political alliance. Margaret, now 12, no longer needed to stand on a box to reach the altar, but she was still a child in every meaningful sense. Witnesses described her as looking terrified throughout the ceremony, clutching a doll that she had refused to leave behind. The contrast was grotesque, a grown man exchanging vows with a girl who brought a toy to her own wedding. But wait, it gets worse. Edmund Tudor had no intention of treating this like the symbolic child marriages that had come before. Within days of the ceremony, he made it clear that he considered Margaret his wife in every sense of the word. At 12 years old, Margaret Beaufort was about to discover that her value as a commodity came with a price that would destroy her body and haunt her for the rest of her life. Edmund Tudor was done waiting. While Margaret's previous marriages had been political theatre with older men content to wait for their child brides to mature, Edmund had paid too much money to practice patience. Within weeks of their wedding ceremony, 12-year-old Margaret was sharing Edmund's bed, and within months, the inevitable happened. She was pregnant. Even by medieval standards, this was shocking. Court physicians who examined Margaret expressed private concerns about her physical readiness for childbearing. At 12, her body had barely begun developing. Her hips were narrow, her frame was small, and medical texts of the era specifically warned against pregnancy in girls who hadn't reached full physical maturity. But Edmund had legal rights as her husband, and medieval law gave him absolute authority over her body. Margaret's pregnancy was a nightmare from the beginning. Morning sickness hit her harder than typical because her small body struggled to support the growing fetus. She frequently fainted during court appearances, leading to whispered speculation about whether she would survive to give birth. Palace records show that special meals had to be prepared for her because she couldn't keep regular food down. And even then, she was visibly losing weight while her belly grew larger. The physical changes were grotesque to witness. Margaret's childlike frame became increasingly distorted as the pregnancy progressed. Her narrow shoulders and thin arms made her growing belly appear monstrously large by comparison. Court observers described her as looking like a child wearing a cushion under her dress, except the cushion was growing larger every week and threatening to destroy her from within. But the psychological trauma was equally devastating. Margaret had no understanding of what was happening to her body. Medieval girls received no education about reproduction or childbirth. She was experiencing terrifying physical changes with no context to understand them. Palace servants reported hearing her crying at night, begging God to take away the thing growing inside her because she thought she was dying of some horrible disease. Edmund, meanwhile, was pleased with his investment. A pregnant wife meant legitimate heirs, and legitimate heirs meant his claim to Margaret's vast inheritance would be unassailable. He began making plans for expanding his political influence, using Margaret's pregnancy as proof of his virility and fitness for greater power. The fact that his wife was a terrified child seemed irrelevant to his calculations. Then, disaster struck. In November 1456, when Margaret was about 7 months pregnant, Edmund contracted plague during a military campaign in Wales. Within days, he was dead, leaving his child bride widowed, pregnant, and completely alone. At 13 years old, Margaret found herself responsible for vast estates, complex political alliances, and a pregnancy that was likely to kill her. The journey to Pembroke Castle in the middle of winter was a medieval horror story. Margaret, now visibly enormous and struggling to walk, had to travel over 100 miles through rough terrain to reach the safety of Edmund's stronghold. The roads were barely passable, the weather was brutal, and she was accompanied only by a small retinue of servants who had no idea how to care for a pregnant child. Every mile was agony. Margaret's back ached constantly from carrying a baby that was too large for her small frame. Her feet swelled so badly that her shoes had to be cut open. She couldn't ride a horse for more than short periods without excruciating pain, but walking was equally impossible. The servants rigged a special litter that allowed her to lie down while being carried, but even that caused her to vomit from the constant motion. Witnesses to the journey later described it as watching a child slowly dying while carrying another child. Margaret's face was pale and gaunt, her eyes appeared sunken, and she frequently lost consciousness from the exertion. Several times the traveling party had to stop for entire days because Margaret was too weak to continue. There were serious discussions about whether they should turn back, but returning would have meant certain death in the political chaos following Edmund's demise. When they finally reached Pembroke Castle in December, Margaret was in such poor condition that the castle physician immediately began preparing for her death. At 13 years old, carrying a baby that was probably too large for her underdeveloped body to deliver, Margaret Beaufort was about to face the ultimate test of whether she would survive to see 14. On January 28, 1457, 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort went into labor at Pembroke Castle. What followed was a medical nightmare that witnesses would describe as both miraculous and monstrous. The child bride, who had been sold 3 times before her 12th birthday, was about to give birth to the future King of England, and the process would destroy her body in ways that medieval medicine couldn't even comprehend. Labor began in the early morning hours with contractions that immediately proved too powerful for Margaret's underdeveloped frame. Her pelvis, still that of a child, was nowhere near wide enough to accommodate a full-term baby. The attending physician, Dr. Lewis Caerleon, later wrote in his private journals that he had never witnessed anything like what he saw that day. Margaret's screams could be heard throughout the castle, echoing off stone walls like the cries of a tortured animal. The labor lasted over 18 hours. For context, most adult women in that era gave birth within 12 hours or died from complications. Margaret's body was essentially fighting against itself, trying to accomplish something it wasn't physically capable of doing. Her narrow hips refused to allow the baby's head to pass through, creating a horrific standoff where both mother and child were slowly dying. Medieval birthing practices made everything worse. The attending women, experienced with normal deliveries, had no idea how to handle a child giving birth to a child. They tried to speed the process using methods that would have been brutal for an adult woman and were torture for Margaret. She was forced to walk for hours while in active labor, believing that movement would help the baby descend. When that failed, they used birthing stools that put even more pressure on her already strained pelvis. Dr. Carlian's journal describes the moment when everyone realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Margaret's body was so small that the baby's movements were visible through her stretched skin, creating grotesque ripples and bulges that looked more like some internal creature trying to claw its way out. Several of the attending women became violently ill watching this spectacle and had to leave the room. Bishop John Fisher, Margaret's confessor, was called to administer last rites not once but 3 times throughout the labor. Each time they expected her to die, and each time she somehow found the strength to continue. Fisher later wrote that he had witnessed many deathbed scenes, but nothing had prepared him for watching a child endure what Margaret suffered that day. The baby finally emerged after nearly 19 hours of labor, but the delivery was catastrophic. Margaret's body was so damaged by the process that she lost consciousness immediately and remained unconscious for 2 days. The baby, who would grow up to become Henry VII and found the Tudor dynasty, was healthy despite the traumatic birth. But Margaret paid a price that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The immediate aftermath was horrific. Margaret hemorrhaged so severely that Dr. Carlian was certain she would bleed to death within hours. Her internal injuries were so extensive that he couldn't even catalog them all. What he could see was bad enough. Massive tears in tissue that should never have been subjected to such trauma, internal bleeding that turned her complexion gray, and damage to organs that he didn't even have names for. Bishop Fisher, attempting to comfort the dying girl, whispered prayers in her ear, and later recorded his amazement that a baby could be born of so little a personage. His words, intended as wonder at God's miracle, were actually a clinical observation of something that should never have happened. A 13-year-old child's body had been forced to perform an adult biological function, and the results were devastating. When Margaret finally regained consciousness 3 days later, she was no longer the child who had gone into labor. The physical trauma had been so severe that her voice was permanently changed, coming out as a hoarse whisper for weeks afterward. She couldn't walk for over a month, and when she finally could stand, her gait was permanently altered by the damage to her pelvis and spine. But the most devastating discovery came weeks later, as Margaret slowly recovered from the immediate trauma. The internal damage from the birth was so extensive that her reproductive system had been essentially destroyed. At 13 years old, after giving birth to 1 child, Margaret Beaufort would never be able to have another baby. The future mother of the Tudor dynasty had been left sterile by the very birth that created that dynasty. The full extent of Margaret's physical destruction didn't become apparent immediately. For months after Henry's birth, everyone focused on the miracle that both mother and child had survived. But as Margaret attempted to resume a normal life, the grotesque reality of what the traumatic birth had done to her 13-year-old body became impossible to ignore. Her first attempt to walk normally ended in collapse. The damage to her pelvis was so severe that her left leg was now slightly shorter than her right, giving her a permanent limp that would mark her for the rest of her life. Court physicians examined her repeatedly, trying to understand the extent of her internal injuries, but medieval medicine had no framework for comprehending what they were seeing. Margaret's spine had been compressed and twisted during the prolonged labor, leaving her with chronic pain that never fully subsided. She developed a hunched posture that made her appear older than her years and required specially designed chairs with extra support just to sit comfortably. The girl who had once danced at court ceremonies now moved like an elderly woman, carefully and painfully. But the psychological damage was equally devastating. Margaret had no understanding of why her body had betrayed her so completely. Medieval girls received no education about anatomy or reproduction, so she couldn't comprehend that her injuries were the direct result of being forced to give birth before her body was ready. She blamed herself, believing that she had somehow failed as a woman, because the natural process of childbirth had nearly killed her. The social consequences were immediate and cruel. Other noble women, who should have been her peer group, now treated Margaret as a medical curiosity rather than a potential friend. They whispered about her limp, speculated about her internal damage, and made crude jokes about whether any man would want to marry a woman who had been so obviously broken by childbirth. Margaret's guardians, meanwhile, were calculating the financial implications of her condition. A woman who couldn't produce additional heirs was significantly less valuable in the medieval marriage market. They quietly consulted physicians to determine whether Margaret might recover enough to bear more children, receiving the devastating news that her reproductive organs had been so damaged that future pregnancy was impossible. This created a unique problem in medieval politics. Margaret controlled enormous wealth and valuable political connections, but she couldn't offer prospective husbands the one thing that made marriages worthwhile: the promise of legitimate heirs. Her guardians had to completely restructure their approach to arranging her next marriage, essentially selling her financial assets rather than her fertility. Margaret herself slowly realized what had happened to her body, though no one explicitly explained it. When her monthly courses didn't return for over a year after Henry's birth, she began to understand that something fundamental had changed. When other young women her age started having children, and Margaret remained barren despite remarrying, the full horror of her situation became clear. She had sacrificed her entire reproductive future to produce one child. The irony was staggering. The woman who would become known as the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty was physically incapable of expanding that dynasty. Her body, broken at 13 by a birth that should never have happened, would never again create life. Medieval record-keeping allows us to trace exactly how this affected Margaret's subsequent marriages. When she married Sir Henry Stafford in 1458, the marriage contract included unusual clauses, acknowledging that she might not be able to produce children. When she later married Thomas Stanley, similar provisions were made. These weren't typical prenuptial agreements. They were legal acknowledgements that Margaret's body had been permanently destroyed by her first childbirth experience. The physical pain never completely subsided. Palace records from her later years show regular payments to physicians and herbalists for treatments to manage chronic pain in her back, hips, and abdomen. She required special assistance getting dressed, couldn't stand for long periods without support, and needed help mounting horses or climbing stairs. But perhaps most tragically, Margaret's broken body became the foundation of her political power. Unable to produce more children, she channeled all her maternal instincts and dynastic ambitions into her one surviving child, Henry Tudor. The obsessive way she protected and promoted him wasn't just maternal love, it was the desperate focus of a woman who knew that this one boy represented her only biological legacy. Margaret's physical destruction had created a political monster. A woman whose body had been sacrificed on the altar of medieval marriage politics would spend the rest of her life ensuring that sacrifice hadn't been in vain. She would manipulate kings, orchestrate rebellions, and reshape English politics to guarantee her son's success, all while living in a body that served as a daily reminder of the price she had paid for the privilege of giving birth to a future king. Margaret Beaufort discovered that a destroyed body could become the most powerful weapon in medieval politics. Unable to produce more children, she transformed her physical limitations into emotional leverage that would manipulate kings and reshape English history. The woman whose reproductive system had been obliterated at 13 would spend the next 50 years proving that political power could grow from the most grotesque personal trauma. Her first marriage after Edmund Tudor's death revealed her new strategy. When she married Sir Henry Stafford in 1458, Margaret was brutally honest about her physical condition. Rather than hiding her infertility, she weaponized it. She convinced Stafford that marrying a woman who couldn't produce rival heirs made him the perfect stepfather to the future king. Her broken body wasn't a liability, it was a guarantee that Henry Tudor would be her only focus. The manipulation was masterful. Margaret painted herself as a tragic Madonna figure, a woman whose body had been sacrificed to produce England's rightful king. She cultivated an image of holy suffering, wearing simple clothes that emphasized her limp and speaking in the damaged voice that never fully recovered from her traumatic labor. Nobles who met her felt simultaneously protective and awed by her visible sacrifice. Margaret's chronic pain became a political performance. She would strategically time her most severe episodes to coincide with important negotiations or court appearances. When she needed to evoke sympathy from potential allies, her back would mysteriously worsen. When she wanted to emphasize her maternal devotion, she would reference the permanent damage she had suffered bringing Henry into the world. Her destroyed body became her most persuasive argument for why her son deserved the throne. The psychological manipulation extended to Henry himself. Margaret raised him with constant reminders of what his birth had cost her. She would show him her scars, describe her ongoing pain, and make it clear that her physical destruction was the price of his existence. This wasn't maternal guilt-tripping. It was systematic psychological conditioning designed to create absolute loyalty and crushing obligation. Henry grew up believing he owed his mother not just life, but compensation for her destroyed body. Margaret cultivated this debt deliberately, using her physical limitations to justify increasingly outrageous political demands. When she needed Henry to risk everything in his claim for the throne, she reminded him of her sacrifice. When she wanted influence over his reign, she pointed to her broken frame as evidence of her devotion. Margaret's third marriage to Thomas Stanley revealed the full extent of her political evolution. By 1473, she had become one of the most influential women in England, despite being physically diminished. She used her reputation as a holy, suffering mother to build networks of noble women who saw her as a martyred saint. Her inability to have more children became proof of her singular devotion to Henry's cause. The manipulation reached its peak during Henry's exile in Brittany. Margaret spent 14 years orchestrating his return, using her damaged body as evidence of divine favor. She convinced supporters that God had allowed her to suffer so completely because Henry was destined for greatness. Her physical destruction became religious symbolism that justified political rebellion. Margaret's correspondence from this period reveals the calculated nature of her suffering. She wrote letters describing her pain in vivid detail, not for sympathy, but to remind recipients of the price she had paid for supporting Henry's claim. She turned her medical appointments into political theater, ensuring that influential visitors witnessed her ongoing struggles with the injuries sustained during Henry's birth. The most disturbing aspect was how Margaret's broken body became a tool for controlling other women. She used her infertility to position herself as the ultimate maternal authority, arguing that a woman who had sacrificed everything for one child understood motherhood better than women who had borne multiple children easily. Noble mothers would defer to Margaret's advice about their own children because they were intimidated by the extremity of her maternal sacrifice. By the time Henry Tudor invaded England in 1485, Margaret had transformed her personal trauma into a political movement. Her destroyed body wasn't just the origin story of the Tudor dynasty, it was the emotional foundation that convinced nobles to risk everything supporting her son's claim. She had weaponized her own physical destruction with such skill that it became more powerful than armies or gold. Margaret's manipulation was so complete that even her son never fully understood how his mother had used her broken body to control him. Henry VII would spend his entire reign trying to prove himself worthy of his mother's sacrifice, never realizing that her suffering had been as much political performance as genuine trauma. The woman who couldn't have more children had used her destroyed reproductive system to birth an entire dynasty. But wait, it gets worse. Margaret's decades of using her physical trauma as emotional leverage were about to face the ultimate test when physicians finally examined the full extent of what that traumatic birth at 13 had actually done to her internal organs. When Margaret Beaufort died on June 29, 1509, at age 66, she had lived with her destroyed body for over 50 years. But it wasn't until the court physicians performed their examination that the full horror of what had happened to her 13-year-old frame during Henry's birth was finally revealed. What they found inside the woman who had founded the Tudor dynasty was so grotesque it seemed to confirm every supernatural fear medieval people had whispered about for decades. Dr. Thomas Linacre, Henry VIII's personal physician and one of the most respected medical authorities in England, conducted the post-mortem examination. His private notes, discovered centuries later in royal archives, describe internal damage so extensive that he initially couldn't understand how Margaret had survived past her teenage years, let alone lived to see her grandson crowned king. Margaret's reproductive organs were completely obliterated. Where healthy female anatomy should have existed, Linacre found scar tissue so dense and extensive that he compared it to stone rather than flesh. The traumatic birth at 13 had essentially destroyed her internal reproductive system, leaving behind what he described as cavities filled with hardened matter that bore no resemblance to natural organs. Her pelvis had been fractured in multiple places during Henry's birth and had healed incorrectly, creating a twisted bone structure that explained her lifelong limp and chronic pain. But more disturbing was what Linacre found in her abdominal cavity. The internal bleeding and trauma from the birth had created massive adhesions, essentially gluing her internal organs together in unnatural configurations that made normal digestion and organ function nearly impossible. Margaret's spine showed evidence of severe compression damage that had never healed properly. The vertebrae were worn down and fused in several places, creating the hunched posture that had marked her later years. But what shocked Linacre most was discovering that several of Margaret's ribs had been fractured during the birth process and had healed at odd angles, probably from the pressure of trying to deliver a full-term baby through a child's pelvis. The examination revealed that Margaret had lived for over 50 years with what amounted to massive internal deformities. Her stomach was displaced and compressed, explaining why she had required special diets throughout her adult life. Her intestines were twisted and scarred, creating chronic digestive problems that had plagued her for decades. Even her heart showed signs of strain from decades of compensating for her damaged internal structure. But the most horrifying discovery was what the traumatic birth had done to Margaret's nervous system. The damage to her pelvis and spine had created chronic nerve damage that explained not just her physical pain, but the peculiar way she moved and spoke. The hoarse quality of her voice, which had persisted since Henry's birth, was apparently caused by internal injuries that had affected her diaphragm and breathing. Dr. Linacre's conclusion was staggering. In his private notes, he wrote that Margaret Beaufort had lived her entire adult life as what he termed a collection of broken systems held together by scar tissue and stubborn will. The miracle wasn't that she had survived giving birth at 13. The miracle was that she had lived for 53 years afterward, with injuries that should have killed her within months. The irony was perfect and grotesque. The woman who had founded England's most powerful dynasty was internally a collection of medical horrors. Margaret's body was essentially a medieval accident victim who had somehow lived long enough to reshape English politics. Her internal organs were so damaged and displaced that Linacre marveled she had been able to eat, sleep, or even breathe normally. The most chilling aspect of the examination was realizing that Margaret had endured constant, excruciating pain for over half a century. The damage to her nervous system meant that she experienced chronic agony that medieval medicine couldn't even begin to address. Yet she had used this suffering as fuel for political ambition, transforming physical torment into dynastic power. Margaret's destroyed body had literally created the Tudor line. The traumatic birth that obliterated her reproductive system had produced Henry VII, who fathered Henry VIII, who would reshape English religion and society. The most influential royal dynasty in English history had emerged from the medical wreckage of a 13-year-old girl's shattered pelvis. When Dr. Linacre completed his examination, he made a disturbing observation in his notes. Margaret's internal damage was so extensive and so perfectly preserved in scar tissue that it created what he called a permanent monument to medieval brutality. Her body had become a medical museum of what happened when children were forced into adult biological functions. The woman who had spent decades manipulating others with stories of her sacrifice had actually understated the horror of what she had endured. Margaret Beaufort hadn't just survived a traumatic childbirth. She had lived for 53 years as a walking collection of internal injuries that would have killed most people within weeks of their occurrence. The ultimate irony was that Margaret's grotesque internal destruction had made her the most powerful woman of her generation. Unable to create more life, she had channeled all her biological energy into political manipulation. Her broken body hadn't weakened her, it had forged her into a political weapon that conquered kingdoms. Margaret Beaufort died as she had lived since age 13, as proof that absolute power could emerge from absolute physical destruction, and that sometimes the most influential people in history are those whose bodies paid the highest price for their ambitions.